Bibi Fahudier, Nangadef, Alafia, Black African Power, all that great stuff. Spirits is flying, pseudos is crying, man. It's your boy Black Panther, man. And this is the Saturday Mossi Show. Gonna be doing this every Saturday, man. Try to get different guests on the show. We're waiting on Dr. Issa right now. Just got a text from him. Let's see. He's updating his Hangout. So, we're waiting on him. Waiting on him right now. Let me try to get some of my teammates in here. Bear with me for a second, family. Trying to get my non-computer tech-savvy teammates in here. Bear with me, family. Bear with me. Y'all know how Africans are sometimes. Just not on time for whatever reason.
Yo, Panther, you can hear me?
Might be experiencing some technical difficulties. All right, that was Dr. Issa. Trying to get him in here, experiencing some technical difficulties. Brother Aziz, what's going on? I see you in the chat room. What's going on, family? Dr. Issa, what's going on? E41.
Yes, sir. E41.
Aziz, what's happening, player?
Hey, I just wanted you to laugh.
You did that. You did that. We got Brother Aziz is one of our newest Mossi members. shares Senegalese origin like myself. Um, reads French, so he's always a good asset to the team. Also deals with linguistics, comparative with Wolof and Metanetia. So didn't know if you were familiar with them, but just wanted to give him that short little introduction. Trying to get the rest of the team in here right now. What I think I'm going to have to do is send the invitation by email because that seemed to work for you two, because I know I sent it to you too, Aziz. So let me.
I don't know what happened. I just somehow got in. I don't know. I didn't even go through the email. It just, as soon as you got off the phone, it took me straight to the Hangout. So,
man, that's weird.
Very weird.
That's weird.
But a lot of weird things have been happening to me on this social media. So, but it's all good. Straight to the
Okay, I just wanted to see if it was broadcasting live. All right. So you seem to be going. Dr. Issa, talk about what you're going to be presenting to us today and talking about.
Yeah, well, today I'm going to talk about African kingdoms in the Americas, post-Mafaa, post-European slave trade. This is a very important topic because, one, we don't see this being talked about in the conscious community. Two, it's more of a notes in how to go about this type of research and why this type of research is extremely important in today's political environment. Mostly because I've been noticing, I'm not new to Black consciousness, but I am very new to what's going on social media, right? The conscious community on social media, and a lot of misinformation. And I think that a lot of this misinformation has high-level politics. And I've been asking myself, why aren't we dealing with the kingdoms and those small city states that many African people in the diaspora come from? Why aren't we dealing with those? Why are we skipping that? I know the politics behind saying that we're indigenous to the Americas. I understand that. But even why those politics? And so today we're just going to talk about these kingdoms and why it's important that we get more information about these kingdoms. Why is it important not only to Africans in the United States, but Africans that are in Colombia, in Haiti, in Jamaica, in Trinidad, in Brazil, in Peru? It's very important. And we Africans in the United States over the last 300 years, 200 years, have led the world in this type of Pan-African scholarship, right? But over the last 30 years, there's been primarily a focus on Kemet. And studying Kemet is dope, right? We took that back. We took Kemet back, right? So now it's time for us to further that study and see what happened to some of the people who left Kemet and migrated to various places, right? Some of them left and migrated west and central. And those who left and migrated became a part of other great civilizations and empires, such as Ghana, Songhai, and Mali. And then at the end of the Songhayan Empire, we have the beginning of the European slave trade, but the Arab slave trade was in vogue also, right? And continues today. And so who are those people? What kingdoms? What was happening before the European slave trade? what kingdoms existed, and where did those kingdoms, those peoples of those kingdoms end up, right? And I think once we start looking at the so-called slave trade in the form of these were human beings who came from ancient kingdoms, and some of these groups have been migrating for quite some time because of phantom, some because of war, a lot of it because of war. Even before the Europeans, the Arabs caused a lot of war, right? Even with the last dynasty in Songhai, right? So I think it's now time that within the conscious community that we begin to look at the literature. This is more of an advanced conversation on notes in written in published works that I've dealt with and have published myself over the last 15 years. This in my own just personal travels throughout West Africa on understand and talking to some of the indigenous historians of various kingdoms on their various migration patterns, right? And how those migration patterns eventually led to what we call the transatlantic slave trade, right? And where those kingdoms are in the diaspora, and how to get African people in the diaspora to begin to identify the kingdoms that they come from, and why this has not been a serious effort, the politics behind it, because it's high level politics. And so this is a no, so it'll probably take about 30, 45 minutes. But I hope that this will be the beginning of a new era of research for those who are really seriously interested in this type of work.
Okay, all right. That's very, very interesting. Fortune Favorite, I seen you came in the chat room. What's going on, brother? Brother
Hey,
Fortune.
good morning. Good morning. Good morning. How y'all doing, good people? It's beautiful to hear from y'all. This is like a late birthday present for me. My birthday was yesterday, and getting to hear Dr. Issa, man, just being in here, man, yo, it's a treat, man. Peace to both of y'all.
Oh man, happy belated brother. Brother Fortune's out in Chicago. He's doing big things out there, not only with music, but making good relations with Africans from Ghana. So you and Dr. Issa should probably talk, because Dr.
Yeah,
Issa.
we met. We
Oh,
met.
y'all met?
I
You
don't know
met
if he remember
at the
the
debate.
event, and then we went to go to IHOP later on. I was sitting right next to Dr. Issa, man. I had the steak and the slab of pancakes, man, and I bought his book. I bought one for me, and I bought one for my friend Kwame. He's got family in Ghana in the political
that's the brother
scene.
you talking about?
Yeah.
Okay, so you did give him the book. That's even better.
Yep, absolutely. That was something he really wanted, because there was some things as far as in the book what they were talking about the symbols that they found in the I believe the 2nd century in Nubia, that they connected to the Sankofa bird and stuff like that. So it's like,
Zinker symbols, huh?
Yeah, because when we talk about West Africa, we have it seems to be a recent history, and everybody's trying to, since they know we immediately came from there, everybody wants to scramble and say, well, hey, a lot of this culture came from the eastern part of Africa. It came from either Egypt or some Muslims or some Hebrew people that migrated. So it's like everybody want to show their influence on West Africa, but a lot of people don't see the Nile Valley contributions. We got all these works, whether they're credible or pseudo or having people feel where people lay claim to the culture of West Africa by showing Semitic or other Eastern influences, but nobody really sees some of the Nile Valley influences that's in West Africa or may have come from West Africa into the Nile Valley.
You're right. And it's important to get cultural context from people that live in the land. So, you know, Dr. Issa, he's been to Ghana many times. He's been other places in the African continent. Brother Aziz, he used to live in Senegal. You know, he's got cultural context. I just traveled to Senegal myself. And, you know, when we go there, we're not going to the resorts. We're not going to lay out on the beach. You know, we're doing research and we're talking with the people. And it's important to ask the people about their mythology and their sacred stories and their spirituality, and what do they say about where they come from? Where do they come from according to them? I think that's the piece that sometimes gets lost in translation, because people have all these hypotheses about where they could have came from, how they got there, how they traveled. But what does the people themselves say? And when you get that cultural context, it'll open up a whole new world to you as far as research and as far as what you may have thought. And it might just be that missing piece that you need. So we're very excited and happy to have Dr. Issa here to share those cultural connections. Brother Aziz, did you want to say something before we let Dr. Issa get rolling?
Oh man, I'm gonna just say I'm really happy to be on the hangout. You know, this is a topic that definitely needs to be expounded upon, and there's a lot of information out there. I myself.
Peace and good morning, Brother Aziz. I'm sorry, I didn't even know you was there. Peace, brother.
That's all good, brother. Peace to you too, and happy born day as well. Happy belated.
Thank you.
But I'm just saying that you know, there's a lot of histories. I've translated some documents from the French that some Senegalese authors have put out about migrations that came from the Nile Valley involving the Fulani, the Wolof, the Soninke, and all the Senegambian tribes. Definitely probably still work to be done on it, but I'm eager to hear what Dr. Issa has to say.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I've reviewed some of his research, and it's definitely thought provoking. Definitely something we could probably have in a future show. All right, Dr. Issa, we want you to go in. Don't hold back, and we'll take questions from the chat room a little later. Give us what you got, Doc.
All right. So we are live, so other people can see this because I did share this on my Facebook wall.
Absolutely.
Okay. Very good. Well, I want to deal with this because I think it's a void, and I think this is the next direction. And like I said earlier, studying Kemet is great, right? Is beautiful, and what this battle that took almost, we can trace it back genealogically, and the historiography of this battle to take back Kemet from white European academia. It started, we can trace the earliest literature, at least in the United States, actually with David Walker's Appeal, right, 1828. And he is one of the first that we know of who begins to talk about the importance of Kemet, and that African people caught up in the slave trade, the European slave trade, were once a part of that great civilization. Now we're talking about the 1820s, you know, the first couple of decades in the 19th century. And many of these people at that time, particularly David Walker, Nat Turner, all of these type of people that we know of who have left their mark in the historical canons, many of them were either African born or had parents or grandparents who were born in Africa, right? So they came from these kingdoms and small city states where they had already compiled a great deal of history, and they had memory, and some of them had written records, and they were caught into this so-called slave trade. So what I wanted to do is, the first thing I did, it was to put up a rough draft of a chapter of a book that I have finished. It's a completed manuscript. And it's right now at a press, an academic press. But I wanted to show people the level of scholarship that it takes to really, really say that you're an expert in the subject. I wasn't trying to be brag. I wasn't trying to brag, but I wanted, because a lot of people say they're experts and they're this and they're that. And just to say you're an expert, the level of type of work that it takes, and the dedication and the sacrifice that it takes to get to a level where one could say that they are an expert, or where one can say that they are, quote unquote, the greatest scholar in the world, right? This is very, very important. So I just put up, a chapter or two of my manuscript, and I wanted people to see the diligence, the charts, the graphs, the various sources that I was using, primary and secondary sources, federal government sources, and how they were documented, and just the written word, how to complete a sentence, how to make a sentence into a paragraph, and a paragraph into a chapter, and a chapter into a book, right? That takes training. You don't get that way through osmosis and waking up one day and saying, okay, I'm the greatest. It doesn't work that way. Nobody, we're watching the Super Bowl now. Most of those guys out there that are going to the Super Bowl, they've been doing this since they were 8. You don't wake up one day and say, okay, I'm the greatest NFL player in the world. No. There's a lot of training going into that. I played college football. I played little league football. I played high school football. It's a lot of work in it, a lot of dedication, a lot of sacrifice. So the same is to go into our studies of our history and our culture. And I want us to understand also, and many of you guys know this, and those who are part of the Mossi clan and those other groups that are out there in the conscious community, you know this, but particularly those in the chat room who are not really not too familiar, but have an affinity toward history. I want you to see how much it takes. And I want us to respect this tradition. It's an ancient tradition. It goes back to Africa. And of course, we continue that tradition up to today, right? So there was one part when I put up my I think I put it on the Amin Ra Squad 5.0. And I even said in one of the notes that I wanted people to pay close attention to page 20 in the manuscript, the chapter, because on page, I think it's page 20 or 21, I began to do a historiography of all of the major works in that subject of Garveyism, right? And now we're witnessing an explosion of Garvey studies in academia, where now I wrote the first sub-regional study of Garvey. I mean, people know about Tony Martin's classical work, Race First, the ideological origins of the Marcus Garvey movement, Universal Negro Improvement Association, right? But that was written in 76. Since then, there have been dozens of other works by Black and white scholars that have now, and now we're getting to the part of, I did the first sub-regional study of the Garvey movement focusing primarily on Louisiana, right? But I did something that was different from any other scholar. And I studied under a scholar who did one of the first local studies. His name was Emory Tolbert. He was the chair of the history department at Howard University. He did his PhD at UCLA in the 70s and worked with Robert Hill on the Garvey collection, the Garvey papers. Those are 16 volumes. And each volume is at least 700 pages of primary sources. 16 volumes. 16 volumes of annotated historical record on the Garvey movement. 1,000 pages each, 90% primary sources. And the person who started that off was Emory Tolbert. He was the senior editor for it. A lot of people think it was Robert Hill, but it was actually Emory Tolbert, right? But what I did in studying under him and looking at Louisiana, I felt that it was necessary to not only look at the Black people who joined the Garvey movement in Louisiana, but to look at why they joined the movement. And in doing my research, at this time I was a doctoral student. I first started when I was doing my master's degree, and I wrote my master's thesis on the Garvey movement in New Orleans. Then when I got to Howard, I was able to get more training, better training under this premier Garvey scholar. And I began to notice a pattern of this concept of Africa within most of the people in Louisiana. And by looking at primary sources such as military intelligence records, looking at the Negro World, their newspaper, the People's Forum. There's a section in the Garvey newspaper called the People's Forum, where every week people from all over the Black world will write in and talk about their chapters wherever they were, whether they were in Australia or Brazil or Louisiana or New York or Cuba or even in South Africa. And what I noticed in Louisiana, there was this affinity, unlike other places, but similar to other places about Africa. And I decided to just look at the U.S. Census. And I will take a name of a person in the who were right in the Negro world in the 1920s and put their name in the U.S. Census Bureau and look at their family background. And one time I did it for a 40-year-old man who wrote in 1922 in the Negro world, and I come to find out that his father was African born in Louisiana. This man was born in 1880, but his father was African born in 1880. And I'm like, whoa, what is going on here? Right? Is this really the origins of the Garvey movement? This dying need to return back to Africa, to return back to the city-states and kingdoms that African people were taken from? Dr. John Henrik Clarke would often say that one thing about what Garvey did was to remind Black people that they once ruled themselves and had come from African states, African kingdoms, African city-states before enslavement. And Garvey came to remind African people of this. Now, I want to point this out too, because I was just dialoguing last night with one of my colleagues, Brother Kwesi, and we were just talking about how young Garvey was. These were young people, full of ambitions. These weren't 60-year-old men. Garvey started this in his 20s and 30s, and it was in the U.S. in his 30s. These were young men, so they weren't well experienced at a whole lot of things. You know how it is when we're young. We're all over the place in many regards. And so when you're young, you make mistakes. We got to look at the mistakes. But this is not a conversation about Garvey. This is a conversation about African kingdoms. And I'm trying to give you my history of why I've come to this particular point and why I think it's important that we turn the corner with our studies, the politics behind it. So in looking at this African, this one African individual, this individual who was born in Africa, but his son is now 40-something years old and running a UNIA chapter, a Marcus Garvey chapter in Louisiana. That says a lot about that individual, that his father was born in Africa, meaning that, but was enslaved in the United States, brought over at a young age of 10 years old and lived to be over 100. Right? So here we have a man whose son who was born in Africa, his father was born in Africa. That meant, and they lived in the same household, and he had brothers and sisters. We can just imagine the conversations that were going on in that household in 1890, in 1900, the father is dead by then. But we can imagine what this man told his children about his grandfather. What nation did he come from? Or what we call, what tribe? What kingdom? Who was his mother and father? Were they of royalty? What foods did they eat? What were their sacred deities? What were their clan deities, state deities? I was talking to a professor, a good friend of mine who's a professor at Cal State Los Angeles. He's from Zimbabwe. And he was telling me how when he first came to the U.S., the U.S. Embassy was giving him problems, and he wanted to go to the shrine and get divination to see what was going on. And the shrine that he went to told him, the spirit medium or the high priest told him that we don't work with that type of work. We only deal with issues that concern the state. So you have shrines, spiritual shrines, mediums that only deal with issues that resolve around the functioning of the state, not personal issues, right? So I'm bringing all of this up. This was a conversation I had a few weeks ago, right? And this is Africa. This is Africa today. This is the Africa that many African people that now find themselves in the islands in the United States and the Caribbean and South America had come from. They weren't just slaves. We have to identify them. And some of them had previously migrated from Kemet, and some of them did not. Some of them were the ones who gave birth to Kemet. And then when Kemet fell, they had to migrate again, right? And some of them ended up right here in the United States. We know that Nat Turner said that he saw the hieroglyphics in the clouds right before his armed resistance movement, right? Where are they getting this type of stuff from, right? So at this point, this is why I talked to you, brother, and said, hey, I think there is a lot of love and affiliation that goes into studying Kemet. And like I said before, is dope. I studied there. I lived in Kemet. I studied there. I was fortunate to have traveled all over Africa and live among the people. Like you said, I wasn't going into the five-star hotels. I always had this want and desire that came from my grandmother. My grandmother coming up out of the Mississippi Delta, who was part Cherokee and part African. But my grandmother's grandmother was African born. And the stories that my own grandmother told me about her, not her grandmother, her great-grandmother, who she said lived to be 102. And she knew her. She said she died when she was 7 years old. My grandmother said her great-grandmother died when she was 7 years old. And she told them about Africa. And here I am now living in Ferguson, Missouri as a young child, hearing all of these stories about my father's grandmother who was African born, right? And so this all shaped me in my desire to want to be trained and know more about Africa and where we came from. And of course, my grandmother had a major part. She played a major part in that. So with that said, about 4 months ago, I did a lecture at a church. It was a part of a lecture series in Brooklyn, New York, called the Mafaa lecture series of the Dr. Ben, Dr. Clark, something like that. The Dr. Ben, Dr. Clark lecture series of the Mafaa Communiversity. It was a communiversity, and we brought in an array of scholars from all over the country. We brought in S.O.Y. Keita. He's one of my mentors. I've known him for 15 years. I even had him on the phone. I'm not sure if you were on that conversation, but it was me, Asar, Ankh, and a few other people with Dr. Keita. And he's going to start coming on a little more regularly. I'm asking him to help.
We love to have him. We love that.
Yeah, he's going to start coming on. He doesn't know anything about technology. Y'all got to understand. A lot of the young people who are in the conscious community got to understand that there was consciousness before the internet, right?
Absolutely.
And those of us who are over 40, I'm 48, right? We were doing this, like I'm telling you, my grandmother started teaching me as a little child about her great-grandmother who was African born. So you can tell the influence that had on me, right? So that's where I started. And then when I was 15, I got Dr. Ben's book and Diop's book and Dr. Clark's, and I was listening to the tapes. And whenever they were coming to town in St. Louis, I would be at those lectures as a teenager, wanting to emulate them, right? So this consciousness for us in the United States started when the first African was brought here and put in chains. This is not to lessen what happened with those groups of Africans who migrated here before then and conducted trade with the indigenous populations here. But the vast majority of us now came as a direct result of the wars that were caused in Africa. And this is why we're talking today. We're going to talk about those wars, or at least I'm going to lead you to sources so that we can start researching what happened. Right now, when I was at this lecture a few months ago, I did this lecture, and I opened up talking about this article. I want you guys, those in the chat room, to Google an article called African Kings Go to Israel. Almost 500 African kings went to a very large gathering in Israel in October of last year. 500. All over Africa. Just Google it. You'll see the articles.
I'm going to try to Google it right now.
Yeah, I started my lecture on this. Why are all of these African kings, indigenous African kings, going to Europe? Going to Israel. What is going on? Now, anybody that's been following me on Facebook knows that I do a lot of research, a lot of reading on contemporary politics regarding the African world. I can tell you what happened in the Gambia, what really went down in the Gambia, how that was a coup d'etat waged by the West, the imperialists. And this guy Barrow, who's now the president of the Gambia, is going to be just like Mobutu of the Congo. He's going to be worse because the West put him in. And why they took off the last president, and why this is the beginning of more and more wars. This was an invasion where in a West African state where ECOWAS, the sub-regional leaders made a decision with Nigeria to invade another African state. And I thought that was crazy because Nigeria is in a 7-pronged civil war itself. It's fighting Boko Haram. It's fighting the Niger Delta. It's fighting the Fulani Muslims who are invading many of the traditional territories of non-Muslims. It's fighting corruption. I mean, it's literally in a 5-pronged civil war. But yet, it had enough resources to send a naval ship to the Gambia to invade another country against the laws, the established laws there. It was a coup d'etat, right? And the fall of Libya and Muammar Gaddafi opened the way for Europe and the West, including the United States, to take full control over Africa. And now they have another plan, this Greater Israel plan, where they got many of our people confused to thinking that they are actual Jews, to thinking this. And I know this because I've traveled all over. And I know what's in the libraries in many of these universities in Africa. And I know what's not in the libraries there. Because I visit, whenever I go into an African country, the first place I'm going is in the library to see their collections and what books that they have there. And even now, one of the Biafra movement, that's another potential civil war. And they got in Nigeria, they got a civil war with the Shiites in northern Nigeria. Right? So they're fighting in Nigeria, a 7-pronged civil war. But yet they had the audacity to go with, because the West told them to go in with Senegal and other countries and invade another African country. Why? Why?
By far,
So,
Dr. Issa?
Let me finish. We can ask some questions afterwards, right? But
Okay.
I'm just trying to set us up, and write down your questions, right? So that you won't forget. So we have this in the last year, these African kings going to Israel, begging the Israelis to recognize them as African Jews. And I said, oh my God, we gone crazy. What is this really about? What are they about to do to Africa? Why are so many African people in the United States, a small group, are now saying that they're not African? They want nothing to do with Africa. Why is this being planted throughout the Black conscious movement that's on social media? A lot of people, I don't want to have nothing to do with Africa. But yet you see them with African symbols and signs and Garvey, RBG, but you want nothing to do with Africa. It's a part of the mass confusion that's going on around the African world, and it didn't stop just here. We can see this. If you got 500 African indigenous kings going to Israel, begging the Israelis to recognize them as Jews, we know something is wrong. Because we know that the history that produced the so-called Jews and Hebrews is ancient. And is rather the Jews should be coming to Central and West Africa begging to be recognized as human beings than us going to them, going to European Jews, begging them to recognize us as Hebrews. Something is wrong, right? So you look at that, and so there are politics behind this. And why are there politics behind this? What is going to happen to Africa in the next 100 years, the next 50 years? What plans do the imperialists have? And what role as we as scholars have in changing that? Information is important. impudent and solid research is important, right? So who benefits from this? Who benefits from African kings going to Israel? Who benefits from the Biafra movement, which is one of the largest indigenous African movements for independence right now in Nigeria? And this is important because many African people in the United States, in Jamaica, in Trinidad, were forcibly taken from what is now known as the Biafra movement. We were taken from that region, those kingdoms there, right? And the British brought us here. And these are parts of history that we don't know. And that's why we can easily dismiss it and say that we're not African, because we don't know the history. And that's why I say the study of Kemet is dope, it's great. But we need to know what happened, what forcibly brought our grandmothers, our great-great-grandmothers and grandfathers to the Western world, right? So I want to start off with Timbuktu. And there's a scholar, and I'm going to name some scholars, so I hope that everybody is out there listening and taking notes. There's a scholar by the name of Michael Gomez. He's a full professor of history at the New York University of New York, right in Manhattan. He's the graduate school there. He's a full professor of history. His classic study that I think that Black people should have given him an award for is called, what is the name of that book? The name of that book is called Michael Gomez, Exchanging Our Country Marks. And that study is a study of African culture in the United States via the transatlantic slave trade. He deals with the African kingdoms. He starts off with the great Garveyism movement, armed liberation movement. I don't call these movements slave revolts because African people were not citizens, and only citizens can revolt. These were armed liberation movements to return them back to sovereignty in the United States, or to go back to Africa and reclaim those sovereign states that they were taken from. And this is what the Garvey movement was about. It was a movement toward reclaiming sovereignty. And this is why I put up on that my piece in academia, although I kind of messed up because I was trying to add some things in Word and messed up the footnotes. On page 22, I deal with my expertise on the subject, and I had to go through all the major sources on that subject and give a historiography to show my dissertation advisors that yes, I've mastered this subject because I reviewed all of this literature, and this is what I found out and why it is important to my study on Garvey. That's what makes you an expert. It's not because you picked up one or two books that makes you an expert. To be an expert in something, it takes years of sacrifice, as I stated earlier. So Michael Gomez's book, Exchanging Our Country Marks. But I want to bring him up now because he's completed a recent manuscript that's over 1,000 pages on Imperial Timbuktu. Why is Imperial Timbuktu important to the transatlantic slave trade? These are questions we need to know. And this is an African American, Michael Gomez. Just Google his name, look for the book Exchanging Our Country Mark, and you'll see an article he wrote in the 90s on Imperial, an academic article that he wrote in the 90s on Imperial Songhai under Timbuktu. What happened in that period that opened the doors for European expansion into Africa? These are important points of references that we need to know. And this furthers the work of what Diop and Clark and Chancellor Williams and Dr. Ben were doing, right? And these ancient migration. And we will find in Imperial Timbuktu that a lot of the histories of African people and their states are written down and how they were conquered and who those leaders were. We will find that. I know through my travels in Ghana, me and Sekou Nkrumah is the last born of Kwame Nkrumah. He's a good friend of mine. I brought him to the United States when I was a doctoral student at Howard University, and we toured the East Coast, just lecturing in churches. But when we were in Ghana together, he pointed out to me, because he was the director of the W.E.B. Du Bois Center, and I was the scholar in residence one summer. And we went up to Kumasi, and he showed me. Kumasi is the capital of the Ashanti people, and he showed me manuscripts, dozens of manuscripts from the 18th century, written by Arab scholars, because the Ashanti didn't have a written language. And so they hired many African Muslims who are Africans at that time who could read and write in Arabic to write their history and to journal all of their notes and their trade routes. And later on, I went up to northern Ghana, and I went to one of the oldest mosques in northern Ghana, and I saw manuscripts that go back to the 17th century in Arabic. I don't read Arabic, but they were telling the history of African people, right? The migrations, what brought them to modern day Ghana? Where did they come from? Why? Why did these clans move like that? There's another book by a professor by the name of Dankwa. He's a professor at Binghamton University. He's the chair of the Africana Studies department there. He's written a great deal on African spirituality. In one of his books called The Making of an African King, he talks about the migration of one of on his father's side. They are Guan. The Guans are now located in present-day Ghana. A lot of them are located in the mountains in the eastern regions and area. But he talks about how this Guan group of people migrated around the 16th century to what is now called the Cape Coast area. And they were one of the first groups there before the Akan Fanti arrived. And he gives a 300-year history of their migration from ancient Ghana, from ancient Ghana, from the Sahel to ancient Ghana to Songhai, and then to contemporary Ghana, and how they settled there 350 years. Even in Ghana, and I'm just dealing with Ghana right now, or Ghana and Nigeria, but even among one of the groups that I studied under, one of my traditional high priests, who is what we call an Ewe, E-W-E, they recently migrated to Ghana. The God people, G-A, God Dagamba people, who now occupy what is now present-day Accra, the capital. They only migrated there 450 years ago. And all of these groups that I'm talking about, from the Senegambia to the Niger River, the Benue River, city-states, many of them are recent migrants to those areas. They only migrated there 600-700 years ago. So they didn't have time to set up these powerful states that we see in other parts of West and Central Africa, like in the Congo. They had some powerful states there, right? So I'm giving you some scholars that are dealing with these issues that you may not be familiar with. Michael Gomez, again, he'll be dropping his book hopefully this year on Imperial Song God and that history. And many of those histories are still there in Timbuktu, written. And some of these scripts are not only in Arabic, but there are indigenous African scripts that they were writing with. Some West African city-states were able to develop their own script writing. Diop talks about this, right? So how do we, what formulates an empire? What formulates a clan and a city-state and a kingdom? I was reading an article in present day, a friend of mine who's from Cote d'Ivoire, who sent me this article of a man who has 100 wives and 350 children. In 100 years, that's a kingdom. That's a kingdom.
Wow.
In 100 years, that's a kingdom. It's a clan now, but in 100 years, that's how kingdoms start. That is the formation right there. That's African culture. This is how we move from clan to city-states to kingdoms to empires. And once you have a clan like that, this man is in his 70s. There's another story that's been circulating on social media for about 2 years, a Nigerian man in northern Nigeria who has about, I think he has over 92 wives. And the Islamic, the Islamic government of northern Nigeria were trying to condemn him. And they were saying that, you know, this is a blasphemy. The Quran only says you can have 4 wives. And he said, my culture, although I'm Muslim, my culture predates the Quran. This is our culture. And they tried to imprison him and threaten him with death, but his wives came to his rescue and the children of his wives. Who's going to mess with a family like that? Right? You go to school, you know, and somebody jumps you and you come back with 15 brothers and cousins, right? That establishes, that is the beginning of a kingdom. This is how kingdoms are started. Then you also have kingdoms are started also when you have certain people who come and unify various clans, right? And then you have people like Shaka Zulu, you know, who was taken away and became a warrior in another kingdom, and then went back home, conquered that, and became a king, and was able to set up the Zulu Empire. I'm only saying this in reference to what happened to us and how we got to the Americas, and how this, our lack, Chancellor Williams taught. I was going over this morning, I think it's chapter 7 in Chancellor Williams' Destruction of the Black Civilization. And y'all, you got to see Chancellor Williams' work as just a basic introduction. Don't think because you've read that book you know it all. No, it's just an introduction. What he's doing in that book is throwing out a lot of ideals and concepts. But he talks about that with the need to study the migrations and understanding the destruction of Black civilization. Because many of these small city states, when the Portuguese come into Africa during the 15th century, yes, they came and they studied and they wrote. There are hundreds and hundreds of pictures of Portuguese explorers. They didn't just come with explorers. They came with priests. They came with scholars. They wrote. They came with artists. They wrote down. They drew the pictures of these kingdoms and mapped out and did maps. This is how we know a lot about what happened with Queen Nzinga. It was through the Portuguese and how they studied that area for a long time, and they sent in their best scholars before they sent in the military. And they studied these states and these small kingdoms, and they were able to infiltrate them over a 100-year period and cause war, which led to our ancestors being brought here. There's another person I think it's important that we look at, and that is Walter Rodney. Now, of course, many of us have heard of Walter Rodney, particularly his class of work on how Europe underdeveloped Africa. But he has another important study that Michael Gomez is building his work off of. And we know that Walter Rodney was this Oxford-trained scholar from Guyana, right? He was a revolutionary. But in his book, The History of the Upper Guinea Coast, 1545 to 1800, he deals with Africa before. He begins to start Arab, European and Arab intervention. Walter Rodney. And once we start looking at Walter Rodney's book, The History of Upper Guinea, The History of the Upper Guinea Coast, 1545 to 1800, we will begin to understand the Senegambia area, right? And why is the Senegambia area important to understanding U.S. history or the Caribbean history? Like in Louisiana, where I do my study, right? Because 25% of all Africans who were brought to the New World via the Europeans came from the Senegambia area. They came during a particular time period. Something happened in history that caused the collapse of Imperial Songhai. And now those Mali and Songhai were Muslim countries. They still saw the importance of maintaining the traditional culture. They saw the importance of this. So not all of them were against the traditional culture. And even today in contemporary Africa, you will see Muslims, imams, and dealing with the traditional cultures, just like you'll see Christian pastors. They'll preach on Sunday, but at night they're in those shrines. I noticed, I witnessed it with my own eyes.
Right.
The same thing with the imams. They're dealing with these ancient frequencies that are carryovers from ancient Kemet, but predate ancient Kemet. Also, another scholar in understanding those African kingdoms and city-states that were captured and sent over to the New World, particularly as it references the U.S. and Louisiana, there's a white scholar by the name of Gwendolyn Hall. She's Jewish. Her husband is black. She came from a group of European Jews who were revolutionaries who migrated to the United States in the 1920s. Right? And she wrote a classic study called Africans in Colonial Louisiana. And she talks about those Senegambian nations that were brought to Louisiana and how they sought to maintain their culture and tradition, and why Louisiana today is the most Africanized region in the United States. Gwendolyn Hall, her book is called Africans in Colonial Louisiana. Right, so I want us to be, the next 15 minutes, I'm going to give more scholars, because I want us to go and look at these scholars, look at their background. Who are these scholars? When you go and look at Michael Gomez, who trained him? And when you come to Michael Gomez, you're going to see a man by the name of Sterling Stuckey. He wrote a classic study, African American from the South, but he was a full professor at Cal State Riverside. He's emeritus professor, meaning he's in retirement now. But he wrote a very important study in understanding Black nationalism. It's called The Ideological Origins of Black Nationalism. This was written in the 70s, classic. And he begins to lay out for the first time why Black people are nationalistic in the United States. And it has to do with their African culture. He talks about the African nations that come to the United States and their resistant movements, not slave revolts. We need to get out of slave revolts. These were armed resistance movements to set up African kingdoms in the United States or in the diaspora with the intent of always going back to Africa.
Hold on for a second, Dr. Issa. Unc, is that you?
Man, you know it's me, man. It's good. What's good, family? Mossi Clan Warriors up.
Good morning.
What's going on, Unc? Glad to have you join us, man.
Hey, what's up, Mark? How you doing, brother?
Man, how you doing, man? What's the discussion
Great.
about? Y'all talking about? What's the discussion?
Yeah, we're right in the midst of it, and
Okay.
we're about 20 minutes from finishing.
Okay.
Yeah.
About African kingdoms in different periods, brother Unc.
And we gathering money to make a community in Wisconsin for all the pseudo.
Man, now there you go. There you go.
The pseudo community.
Go ahead, Dr. Issa. I'll finish what you finish your thought.
So we're talking about, so Michael Gomez is a student of Sterling Stuckey, right? But he uses a lot of Sterling Stuckey's work, right? Because Sterling Stuckey wrote his classical study, The Ideological Origins of Black Nationalism. He wrote that in the 70s. And that brought about a major change in how we look at what we call African American history, because it is Stuckey who is the first scholar to identify these African kingdoms in West and Central Africa and their influences in the United States, not only culturally, but politically. And his major theme is the African ring shop that we see within the traditional African Black church, particularly in the South. The ring shop being the formation of African culture in the United States. And this is where Michael Gomez starts with his Exchanging Our Country March. He starts with the revolution that was brought by Denmark Vesey, and how Denmark Vesey went into the plantations throughout Virginia, throughout South Carolina. And on those plantations, you still had African kingdoms there. And they were fighting each other on those plantations. So if you were at war with each other because of the Arab and European invasions in the Senegambia area, when you got on those ships and you ended up in the United States or in the islands, you were at war with yourselves there too. And so what Denmark Vesey does is go and tell these various African nations who are on plantations in the American South that your brother from Africa is not your problem. You have a bigger problem. And with Gomez's book, we're able to, for the first time, we're able to show how African American culture developed. Because the title is called Exchanging Our Country March. It's changing your African kingdom for the formation for a greater cause. which is the beginning of African culture in the African political culture in the United States. It starts with the Garveyism armed revolution, right? So, but more importantly, he starts off dealing with these kingdoms and where these people come from, Michael Gomez. But he's getting the basis of his work from Sterling Stuckey. And Sterling Stuckey is getting his work from a lot of his ideals from Walter Rodney, the Guyanese scholar. And so there's another scholar. He's a white scholar. I talked to him about 3 weeks ago on this research that I'm doing now. His name is John Thornton, A Classic Study. John Thornton's book, he teaches at Boston University. I was taught by his wife. His wife is from Trinidad. She's black, but he's European. And John Thornton is interesting because he was a captain in the U.S. military. And he studies the wars in Africa that led to the transatlantic slave trade. And he's looking at military formation in Africa during the 15th, 16th, and 17th century. He's looking at their militaries, how they fought, what resources they used, how they used battle, and how they used those same battle techniques in Haiti and in the United States, in other parts of the diaspora. So they are bringing over their African cultures to the West, to the so-called New World via the transatlantic slave trade. This is John Thornton. He's a professor at Boston University. Go to the website at Boston University's history department, and you will see John Thornton and look at his works. The same with Michael Gomez. Go to his department and look at his works. Go to University of California, Riverside, and look at the works of Sterling Stuckey. Look at his scholarship and their publications. John Thornton and his wife is Linda Thornton. She writes on Angola specifically. Angola before European conquest and after, and where do you find these Angolan citizens throughout the United States? On the East Coast, up until around the 19th century, in places like New York and New Jersey, you had what you call African Election Day, where you had African kings being selected right here in the United States, all the way up until the late 19th century. And many of the people here still bear the names of their ancestors. We know this because in Manhattan, we know that the whole park there, what's the name of that park in Manhattan? The big park? Seneca, that was an African.
Seneca Village?
Seneca Village, exactly. Though that was an African, settlement. And in Seneca Village, they had African kings, the same African royalty that was brought over, literal royalty. And they had their royal celebrations. And many of those families are still here. They don't know what kingdoms they come from because we're not dealing with that history. That type of history is not mainstream. Right? So even if we look at Suriname, right, what was then called Dutch Guyana in South America, right now, to this day, in Suriname, you have 7 African kingdoms there, and they have maintained their traditional culture to the extent where in some of the places, particularly in Ghana, where they were taken from, they were primarily taken from Ghana and Nigeria. But in Ghana, where they were taken from, they are doing stuff that people in Ghana had long forgotten. Rituals, ancient rituals. Particularly with the cry, the spirit, the crown spirit, they are still doing those to this day. In Suriname, you have 7 African kingdoms there, and they have kings. They defeated the Dutch and maintained their culture for the last 300 years. To this date, they are there. They know they can tell you exactly what clan they came from, and they can give you a historiography of their kingdoms for the last 1,000 years. And even their kingdoms in what is now known as Suriname for the last 300 years, their royal families. Those who occupy royal seats, they're there. This is Suriname. There's a book called I Sought My Brother. It's even a documentary on it, where a Harvard University African-American anthropologist goes there to find out if he travels down the Amazon River in the 70s to discover these people. And when he found them on the banks of the Amazon, they walked up to him and asked him, "Why are you here? If you are here to try to bring us back into slavery, we will kill you now." This is in the 70s. And he told them that I was your long lost brother, and I was captured by the British, and my ancestors were taken to the United States, and I'm here to study you. And they asked him, "Are you still a slave?" They asked him in the indigenous tongue, and he said, "Why do you ask that?" He said, "Because you wear the clothes of the white man, and we defeated the white man 300 years ago. So your people must still be slaves." I Sought My Brother. It's a study on the Africans in Suriname. They still maintain their traditional culture today. They have their kingdoms and their royal families, and all those people who make that society important. They even fought 2 civil wars in Suriname and won. Even recently, they just won last year a United Nations decision because the president of Suriname was taking their land and giving it to the Chinese and the Indonesian, and they took them to the United Nations, and they won that case, a case on the rights of indigenous people. But they're not saying, unlike us, you hear some of us saying, "Oh, we're indigenous here. We ain't got no connection to Africa." They're not saying that. They're saying, yes, we are indigenous here, because the indigenous people gave us sacred knowledge on how to possess the totems here. But our ancestry comes from Africa. You can Google the recent UN decision that has changed all indigenous societies all over the world, where now every government in the world has to first go to these indigenous societies before they start mining and cutting down timber. This is a United Nations ruling that just took place last year. And this was due because of these indigenous Africans. They still live like they lived 500 years ago in Ghana and Nigeria, and they still call on the same deities. I know because I know some of them. I talk to them. They're in New York. They're in Delaware. I met some of them in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. Also, in dealing with slavery and understanding the formation of these African kingdoms in the United States and elsewhere. I just saw a video. I know Brother Ankh loves calling young Pharaoh young pseudo, right? But young pseudo just did a presentation on the histories of the slave trade, and I'm like, how do you do a history of the slave trade and you don't even know the major scholars on that subject? You can't say you're an expert on the slave trade unless you've studied the works of Joseph Inakori, who was a professor at Rochester University, was a Nigerian, and how he became the top scholar in the country on the slave trade by taking down a European scholar by the name of Philip Curtin. Joseph Inakori, Inikori. Look at his scholarship. Go to this university, Google his name, and look at his scholarship and what he's talking about with those kingdoms in Nigeria.
What's his name? One more time, Dr. Issa.
Joseph Inakori. He deals with the slave trade and the kingdoms of the slave trade.
Spell it
and
one
when
more time,
he came
Dr.
on
Issa. Joseph Inakori. Spell it one more time.
Nikori. Inikori. He's important because at that time, in the 80s, until he came, the numbers games on how many Africans and where they were taken from was purely dominated by European scholars. Philip Curtin was the lead. He wrote a book called The Census in the 60s. And that was the seminal study on the slave trade. And of course, Europeans are not going to talk about the kingdoms and all of the destruction that they caused. And so this young Nigerian scholar comes around and challenges it for the first time. It causes a lot of waves in academia. And now he is one of the leading scholars on what happened in Africa that brought various African kingdoms and city-states to the United States and other places. And now when we talk about understanding African kingdoms in the United States, we got to understand the British and their history and their role. Because it is the British who fund the invasion of Timbuktu. They fund this. They even provide a lot of ammunition and money. Because the British got into the slave trade game late. The Dutch were responsible for Newfoundland and what is now known as Delaware. Some of the first Africans that are brought into Delaware. They are coming straight from the Congo. And then the Portuguese, right? But the British are the last of all the Europeans to get involved. And they did the most damage. And most of us who are brought to the United States and to the islands on the British territories, we come via the British. We got to understand what happened. Right? So we got to understand the works of Joseph Inakori and Philip Curtin. There's another European scholar, premier scholar on this subject that's worthy of studying. His name is Joseph Miller. He's a professor at the University of Virginia, and he deals with African nation formations in the Americas, particularly the United States. But he also deals with many of those African kingdoms before the British came in. And like I said earlier, the British wrote and painted diagrams and pictures of these city-states before the European slave trade. They wrote this and they brought in artists. So we have complete pictorial histories from that time period of these kingdoms and how they look. Right? I've done presentations of these kingdoms and how they look. There are hundreds and hundreds of photographs, not photographs, paintings of these kingdoms and the clans and how they operated. So Joseph Miller is important. He's at the University of Virginia. Go there, look at the faculty webpage and look at his scholarship, his writings, and read his books. Read them and study them. There are a few more that I want to talk about really quick. Why is the University of Wisconsin, Madison important in the study of African kingdoms in the United States? You can't study African kingdoms in the United States unless you understand African history. 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century African history. The University of Wisconsin-Madison, go to their website, look at their African Studies program. Also look at Michigan State and the University of Michigan. Go to their Africana Studies department or history departments and look at their experts in these subjects of Africa and look at their research. You can find their stuff, their articles on many of the online, like JSTOR and things like that. But I want us to start looking at the dissertations, because every year hundreds of dissertations are being produced all over the world on African history. Hundreds. I'm African world history. What happened in Suriname? What happened in Trinidad? What happened in Belize? What happened in Mexico? Right? And what we will find, particularly as it relates to the United States, because that's where my expertise lies in, many of these people who are formulating and who are organizing these so-called mass slave revolts, in which I say earlier, they're not slave revolts, they are armed resistance movements, because these people are not citizens. They are under a dictatorship. In fact, they are under a totalitarian dictatorship during that period, where their entire lives are controlled. But many of these people who are organizing these resistance movements, many of them are descendants. Either they are, if they are African born, they are claiming that they are from the royal courts of certain kingdoms or certain families, or they are descendants of that. And a great source for this type of information are the slave narratives. Many of the slave narratives, they tell you who they are and where they come from in Africa. I come from the Ashanti Kingdom. I come from the Afanti Kingdom. My mother was the king of this. My mother was the king's first wife. I was next in line to be king. Or if it was a female, my mother was the queen mother. Or my mother's brother was the king. Or my mother's brother was the chief linguist of the royal court. Venture Smith said his father was a king. Martin Delany, on both sides, his mother and his father's side, were kings and queens. Right? Martin Delany. These are Africans. And now we understand Martin Delany's grandmother was the princess of a king. And we understand his drive to go back to Africa. Not only to go back, but to go back to the kingdom in which he was taken from. And he tried. He even convinced the black middle class in the 1850s to put up the equivalent of $1 million so that he can go and look for a homeland for Africans in the United States to return to. And he even tried to go back to the kingdom in which his ancestors were taken from, but there was still too much war in Nigeria. And he ended up making a deal with 8 kings on the coast of Nigeria, Martin Delany. And then the Civil War breaks out. So there are two more people I think we need to look at, recent studies. Or one. Let's just deal with one. I'm giving a lot. Two. One is the name of Sylvia Diouf. Diouf. How do you pronounce that, brother? Hello?
We Dr. Issa?
Yeah. How do you pronounce that? Diouf?
Diouf?
Right.
I'm not really sure. Aziz, how would you say that?
Y'all hear me?
Because
Okay?
it would be Jean. I know that part would be Jean.
Yeah, the O and the U make a oo sound, so it's Joof.
Joof.
Okay. All right. Her name is Sylvia Diouf. She wrote two books. One is called Servants of Allah, and the other one is called The Slave Ship Colita, Clotilda. Right? I forget where she did her doctoral, her PhD in history from, but I used her book in my first chapter that I put up on academia. And I put on the Amin Ra. I think I put it in the Amin Ra 0.5 scholarship. Right now, why is her work important? I don't like some of her writings because she has this entrenched hatred that's shared by a lot of African immigrants toward African Americans, and a lot of African Americans have this intense hatred and lack of understanding of African immigrants too. So it goes both ways. But at least in scholarship, we try to hold ourselves up to a higher standard and try to deal with the history and not deal with the contemporary politics. And so in her book, the slave ship Colidia was a ship that was brought in 1860, right before the Civil War. I think I'm right with the date. I may be off a year or two. But it brought more than 300 people to Alabama. And she follows some of those families up into the 1940s, where the last person who was brought on that ship died in 1939. And talks about his life in Benin, where he was taken from. And his children and his grandchildren, they're still in Alabama. One of the most notable psychiatrists comes from that lineage, right? Psychopathic racism. You ever heard of that term?
Yes.
Right. So you know
Amos
the scholar
Wilson.
who?
I heard about it from Amos Wilson.
Right. Amos Wilson gets it from Bobby Wright. I think that was his name. He was a psychiatrist. I think that was his name. But he comes from that area. He's a descendant of those Africans who were brought here on that ship in 1860. Wow. And the last person who was brought on that ship died in 1939 to 1940. But the whole time he was always trying to get back to his homeland. He was young when he was brought here. He was like 8. An 8-year-old child has a lot of memory about his mama and his daddy and what his mama and daddy is telling him in the sacred rivers and streams and everything. Right?
Right.
So read her books. Also, what's important about her books, and Michael Gomez has other books that deals with Islam in the United States, because 20% of all Africans who were brought to the United States were Muslims. They were Muslims in the sense of religion, but they were African in the sense of culture.
Yeah, that's common.
That's a whole nother, that's a whole nother subject. And one last book, one of my brothers, Brother Kwesi, he's a professor at Manhattan College. He wrote a book on the Afrikans in the Americas. It's a seminal study, watershed study. Oxford Press, good friend of mine. We did our PhDs together at Howard. He was in African Studies. I was in the history department. The book is called The Afrikans in the Americas. Let me see if I can Google the exact title real quick before we open up everything to questioning. And his book is important because and I was in his office 2 weeks ago. It's called The African Diaspora in the Americas by Kwesi Kanadu. He's a full professor of history at Manhattan College, right here, right in New York. And this is an important book because it demonstrates for the first time we get a full glimpse of African people, what they were doing in West Africa, and what they ended up doing in the so-called New West, New World, in the Caribbean and in the United States. Why is that important? Because myself, for the last 15 years, I've been with a group of Afrikans, studying with them, under them, that are based out of New York. And they trace their lineage to Ghana. And one of the founder, Nana Dinzulu, took hundreds and hundreds of African Americans to train in the 70s and 80s in Ghana, to train as priests. And now there are thousands of Akan priests all over the United States because of this. But that history didn't start with Dinzulu. These Akan groups have made their marks, not just the Akan, but the Wolof and all other groups, the Congolese. If you know the history, you'll see how they left their historical marks in the United States, because they are the ones who built the United States. In D.C., you'll see these symbols all over D.C. In Louisiana, you'll see their symbols. In New York, you'll see their symbols if you know the history. These are African kingdoms in the United States. So again, the last book is Kwesi Kanadu, Kwasi Kanadu, Konadu, the Afrikan Diaspora in the Americas. And once we begin to understand this, the latest scholarship and information on this subject, and we know that some of the Akan groups claim that they migrated from the east, from Kemet, and some of them got caught up in what we call the transatlantic slave trade, and many of them are still returning back and forth. Kwesi Kanadu even traces his own family back to an Akan group. He's from Jamaica. His family is from Jamaica, but he was born here. Right? And then we'll begin to understand, have a bigger picture of how we started off this conversation earlier with the Greater Israel Plan and 500 African kings going to Israel, begging the Israelis to recognize them as African lost tribes, as Jewish lost tribes. This type of foolishness. When they weren't lost, they don't have to go beg some group of people that are not even a part of your group for recognition. When your tradition and culture predates what is called Judaism. We know this. I know the Mossi clan knows this, right? Because then we begin to understand that history is not just for history, it's politics and geopolitics. And what the real role in all of this is. Because some of them know what is taking place, and they're seeing these reverse migration patterns, brother, where a lot of Africans born in the diaspora, not just in the U.S., not just in the islands, but you find this going on in Peru. You find this going on in Colombia. You find this going on in Brazil, that they are now seeking and asking what clans they are coming from. And we're seeing the beginning of a reverse migration. And they want to stop that by destabilizing all of West and Central Africa. This is why history becomes important. This is why we see the seven-pronged civil war in Nigeria and many other civil wars to come over the next 10 years throughout West and Central Africa. And it has a lot to do with you finding out what clan you come from. And knowing that some of those family members, some, in my family clan, I'm the first to return. My grandmother on my mother's side had 15 children. But I'm the first in that lineage since the transatlantic slave trade to return. Not only did I return, I gave birth to children on the continent from certain strategic kingdoms. So not only are we returning, but we are reclaiming. And once you give birth to a child in a particular kingdom, you have access to those resources. Now, you have a say on behalf of your children on the daily politics of the family and the clan and the kingdom. And those who want to go and extract those minerals, you have a say in that. You have a say in the collection of the shea nut. My children of my recent children, they come from the kingdom of the Kassena people in northern Ghana and in southern Burkina Faso. In that area, there's plenty of gold and gold in the sense of minerals, but I say the shea nut is gold and other medicinal properties there. There's also gold. It also has a lot of value. And now I advocate on my children's behalf because of that. And a daughter who comes from an Akan Gwa people, I advocate on her behalf. And she's preparing now, she's a freshman at Morgan State, and she's preparing to go back. She was raised there, but she's been here since she was 6, and she's now preparing to go back this summer to learn the indigenous culture and what it takes to get involved politically in that society.
That's what we need. That's what we need right there.
This is why we look at this history. But what I'm saying, it's so many. This is happening all over the diaspora. So ancient Kemet didn't stop there. This is what we were trying to show in that little bitty pamphlet, Amen. This is what Du Bois was talking about. The formation of the first black church was nothing more than was a recreation of those African kingdoms. And the pastor at that time became the king because you weren't allowed to have African culture in the United States. It was against the law at that time. So everything that we talked about, I think is important. You know, I hope that those who are listening have some basic understanding of where we're going and what was said and what needs to be done. We need to study what's going on. Even when we talk about studying Kemet and Nubia and those other kingdoms,
there are a lot of dissertations that come out every year on these subjects. A good search for Nubia and Kemet, or Egypt rather, and digital dissertations will bring up all the dissertations that have come out for the last 20 years on that subject. And many of those dissertations are not published. So you don't know those work unless you're trained in that area. You don't know the latest information unless you're trained. You've gotten the formal training in that area.
Dr. Issa,
Right, but
let me know when they come out, since I got access to JSTOR and.
No, you can go now. When we get off, you can go now. Just go and look at digital dissertation, and put in dissertation. Just put in a general search for Egypt and Nubia, and you'll see. Or put in a general search for various African kingdoms. Or if you're interested in African kingdom formation studies in the Americas, particularly the United States or even Brazil, do the same thing. And 90% of the dissertations are not published. And the only way you're going to know this information is that you're trained in that area. And this is a part of a training right now. This is a training. So now we know, or you can go to a public library, a university library, and most public and university libraries do have access to those databases. And you can pay for digital dissertation too. I don't know how much it costs for a subscription, but why pay when you can go to a library where your taxes goes toward, and look this up, or a university library.
Absolutely.
Right. Yesterday, I spent 7 hours at Columbia University Library. Last week, I spent 2 days in the Schomburg Center doing research. 90% of the latest information you're not going to find on the internet. A lot of people think they can just Google it. No, it's in journals. You're not going to find this. And even the journal costs, unless you have a subscription to it.
You're speaking Brother Unk's language right now.
That's right.
I know he's really in tune with the journals. But we're going to
the journals is important
in the panel.
All right.
Hey, Ben, real quick, bro. Ben, real fast.
Man, where you come from?
Can you send that video? Hey, send that video to me you sent to my phone.
Send it to you where?
Facebook.
Okay, I'll do that.
Appreciate that, bro.
The first question from Brother Niami Umbutu, and he is asking,
where's he from?
Revolutionary history is rarely talked about in Africana studies. What is behind this? What is the reason behind this?
It's political. It's political. Because this type of history, this knowledge, you see what we did. It took us 100 and something years to recapture Kemet. Right? And you see how that has changed. That's a culture now. There are not too many places in this country where you can't go where you have a brother and sister that has a tattoo of an Ankh on their arm or their back. That's culture. Culture is so important in this memory, this ancestral memory. And the one thing that people who are involved in exploitation of indigenous groups, the first thing they do is try to take them away from their memory of their families. Going back. Because they are the only ones that have a history that go back 500 years. Right? You're conquerors. So they don't want you thinking that you have a history that goes back 5, 7, 10,000 years, and that you can, let's say, for instance, Brother Kanadu. Let's take it home. My daughter, Kosowai Santua, who was born in Accra, Ghana. Her family is from the mountains in eastern Ghana. And my daughter can now claim a history that goes back 7,000 years, where we can go into the kingdom of where her mother is from, and the indigenous historian can give you a history of the leaders for the last 3,000 years.
Mm.
And their migration path. What power is that? That's far longer than that of the Queen of England. That's far longer than any of those Arabs.
That's true. We got another
Right?
question.
So
So
I hope I answered that question. It's politics. History is politics, and it shapes consciousness. And as Dr. Clark always said so elegantly, you cannot continually oppress what? A historically conscious people.
Hey, Panther.
You can't.
Yeah, brother.
Can I add something to that?
Go ahead, brother.
I just want to make sure and make it clear that the first mistake is to ever think or ever believe that those who oppress you is responsible for you understanding and promoting your own history. Although a lot of people are now donning the unks, right? They do not understand that civilism is filled of pseudoisms. And that's why we fight so hard. So I just want to make this real clear that we are responsible for teaching the revolutionary history, right? Plain and simple. We are responsible for our own folklore, our own ideas, and our own concepts. So at the end of the day, this battle against pseudoisms is very important, because if you're teaching a bullshit fake history, right, with Kemet, then you're doing the same thing that the racist white supremacists are doing. Their job is to confuse you and keep you confused. Their job is to give you a false history. So if you teach pseudoisms, you're doing the exact same thing. And as a matter of fact, you're in partnership with the racist white supremacists. So I don't want to hear nobody say, well, I'm Raw Squad, you're dividing the community. You goddamn right. There's a line being drawn in the sand. Those who have the correct information and the correct history, and those who do not, and those who refuse to study and make up the shit as they go. So we're listening very closely to Dr. Issa, because he told you very clear, put the time and study in, study the journals, study the information, cut the crap. I just want to kind of put that out there, brother.
And you're absolutely right, because at first, you know, like I said, I'm new to the social media conscious, but I ain't new to conscious community, right?
Right.
You missed the early part, but you're right, because you were telling me months ago why people like young Pharaoh was dangerous. And I kept saying, because I didn't understand the impact. I didn't know that these people had thousands of our youth following them with these lies and this lazy scholarship. It's not, and you're right. They're worse than, it's not even a partnership, they're worse.
Yep.
Because what they are doing literally, I mean, you don't even need a white man with what they're doing. The white man couldn't do it better.
That's right.
Oh, bad.
I mean, some of the work y'all doing is so great. I saw one video, and I even talked to the brother where he pointed out where young Pharaoh getting all his knowledge from. And then I get on some other TV, and I see a Lion Lex, Zion Lex, and you know, this dude, why do you want to fight me? I didn't realize until I went to the shop search that his whole damn book is plagiarized. Not only, but it's plagiarized for white supremacy.
That dude is ill.
Not even white. These are white supremacist pseudo scholars.
Yeah. Yep.
And they're using and regurgitating their information as if they're the smartest people in the world. And that's dangerous, because real knowledge and mastery of that is a lifetime of work. You listen to Dr. Clark and Dr. Ben as they talk about how long it took them to master this knowledge. And the Harlem History Club was a university. It was a literal university where they sat down, wrote papers, got critiques, had to go do research.
Mm-hmm.
It was a university.
Dr. Issa, we got another question in the chat room. The brother Sean P. from the CESU Meta Nurture group. He says, can we expect more articles related to the subject matter, and will you provide more information regarding the kidnapping of our people and the debunking of the indigenous claims?
We'll say that again. Can they expect what?
Let me say it one more time. Can we expect more articles related to the subject matter?
Well, what articles is he referring to when he says more?
You know, just more references of, you know, what you were.
Well, yeah, you know, yes, you know, but this stuff takes time and it takes resources, right? That's another thing, you know, and I'm going to say this, you know, look, I didn't come from a rich family. I'm Black. You know, my mother had an 8th grade education. My father had a 9th grade education. My grandmother couldn't read. My grandfather could barely read. We straight from the Mississippi Delta and moved up to St. Louis in the 50s looking for jobs, right? And we found them in those factories. So I'm the first generation within my grandmother's clan on both sides to go to college. So I had to take out student loans, bachelor's degree, master's degree, PhD, $170,000 in student loans. It costs to get taught. It costs money, resources, travel, right? So knowledge ain't free like people think it is. And because they're just, hey, Google, how can I find, you know, and they think that they're going to get the real information, and they get a lot of pseudo stuff. And that's what they're regurgitating, and they having lectures on the hidden history of slavery.
Not me, I got mine from the extraterrestrials.
Yeah, all of this foolishness. And it's dangerous. And you're right. It's dangerous. And the line has to be drawn. It has to be drawn. I've taught on a collegiate level for 15 years. You know, you don't get hired to university if you don't know what you're talking about. Right? And so when you see somebody who just wakes up one day, and now I know where he's getting all of his stuff from, and they're saying they're the greatest scholars in the world, you won't even hear the scholars in the world say that.
Right.
Another person I forgot, his name is Gerald Horn. Oh my God, how could I have forgotten Gerald Horn? Homeboy, Ferguson, elder. He's a full professor at the University of Houston, has over 40 scholarly books, 40. Not essays, books with references, and he's going into archives all over the world. 40. He put out 2 last year, one on Paul Robeson and one on the Haitian Revolution. And it's that book that Tariq Nasheed is basing his movie off of. And I hope he gives Gerald Horn credit.
We'll see.
If he doesn't, then we'll blast Tariq Nasheed.
No problem.
Because that's where the basis of that research is coming from. Gerald Horn's study on the Haitian Revolution. And those groups, who are these Haitians? They are migrant of Afrikan Kingdoms. And they use their indigenous practice to overthrow all of the European powers.
There's another book on that with the foreword by Leonard Jeffries and James Small. It's by Wade Nobles, Island of...
yeah, but no. See, Wade Nobles, there's a difference, right? That is not Wade Noble's area of research. Do you know what Wade Noble is? You know what his background is? So you can't even compare that book to what Gerald Horn just put out.
No, I was just giving it a reference. That's all.
Well, this is what I'm saying. Wade Noble's book is nothing but secondary sources. Gerald Horn's book is nothing but primary sources. meaning that you got to read French. You got to go into those Haitian archives and interpret those documents yourselves. Because they were writing. They could write. Toussaint could write. But you got to read French to know what he was saying. You got to have a history. So I'm not saying that Wade Numble's book is good for a brief introduction, but Gerald Horne's stuff is all primary, and that's the difference. Wade, I forget what Wade Noble's background is, but he's not a historian. Like I can't go. I'm a trained historian, so I'm not going to go and write a history of the medical field unless I was trained in that area. Or psychology. My daughter's in school she wants to be a psychiatrist. That's not my area. I don't have a PhD in business and finance, so you're not going to hear me talking about that as an expert. That ain't my area. I stick in my lane. That's my lane.
I was a professor of Africana Studies at San Francisco State University, where my mother went to school at. So,
yeah, but in Africana Studies, we have various disciplines. You have sociology, political science. I'm a professor of Africana Studies, but my area is the African diaspora in U.S. history. Those are my areas, and specifically within that, I look at nationalism. Nationalism, that's my area. That's my specific area. Like everything I talked about now was all in my area, nationalism. Nationalism from Africa and those nationalistic communities in the Americas post the Mafaa up to Garvey. All right. So even in Africa.
Our next question is from King Khalid Ali. He says, when were the last slaves brought to the Americas?
Well, first we got to get out of this thing of calling them slaves. These were human beings.
Kidnapped victims.
Right. These were human beings that came from an area. There's a politics behind using the word slaves. You don't give them a place of origin. And you when we use those words, and this is not a chastisement, right? Excuse me for coming off like that, but when we use those type of words, right, we generally fall in the same place of our oppressors because they don't want us to have a memory. When I talk about these people, I call them Akans, I call them Eves, I named their regions, the Senegambia, I call them Wolof, Bambara. Right, because that gives them a geographical location. So the question,
Dr. Issa, real fast.
The question,
suppose we don't know the geographical region, right? Which most people don't.
I can't hear you, brother.
I said, suppose people don't know the geographical region, right? So,
well, this is why we're on the Mossi Clan. So
let me finish. And I'm saying, so if we don't know the geographical region, what we do recognize is that we was stolen from Africa, right? Kidnapped victims. So if we know the origin, we'll say they're kidnapped victims from such and such and such and such, because that's the proper identifying thing. Slavery was legal, but kidnapping has always been illegal. So I agree with you with one half of it. They was kidnapped victims from Gambia. They was kidnapped victims from West Africa. They was kidnapped victims from this. We need to start identifying with the crime. The crime was kidnapping, because slavery was not a crime to these European nations. I just want to put that in the world.
Well, all right.
Okay.
They were kidnapped, but there was war. They were prisoners of war too. So there was warfare. And this is what we talked about in the beginning part. The wars that were waged against these African people, the wars that were waged, right, which forcibly brought them in, forcibly allowed the Europeans who collaborated with certain African ethnic groups, but somebody was going to go. you know, because the wars were there. So it was either you or me.
Was Cujo Lewis the
And then
last
eventually
case?
all of us ended up being taken away.
What was you
Even
saying,
those
Brother
who
Fortune?
collaborated ended up being taken away.
I said, was Cujo Lewis? Was he the last case? Because that was way after it was abolished here in the
Yes,
Americas. They brought
that's him. Yes, that's what the book, the last slave ship is about.
the
So what
Clotilde
year
Right.
in
was that?
But I
African
want y'all
town.
to get the book. Get the book. Read the book. Because there are a lot of points. A lot of people that will go, they'll do a Google search, and they'll get a brief. No, get the book, because there's a lot of history and references in the book. And look at it, because I'm talking to the Mossi clan. I'm not talking to First Fifth Avenue Baptist Church. Right? Y'all are advanced in this.
So what year was that, Brother Fortune, for the brother that asked the question?
Oh, Cujo Lewis, that would have been around 1859, 1860.
Okay, so 1859, 1860, Brother King Khalid Ali.
There's a ship called the Clotilde, and they created what you call is it Africa Town? I don't know if it was Mobile, Alabama. But they had
Yes,
an Africa
Africa
Town.
Town. Yes.
Mobile,
Bobby
Alabama.
Wright
I've been
comes from
through that.
there.
I didn't know it was Africa Town when I was there, but I've been through there.
Take
Yeah,
a good
man,
look at
that's
Cujo
Africa Town.
Lewis.
They still
Take a
act
good
like
look
it's
at him.
Africa down there.
For people
Okay.
who say we don't share a commonality as far as looks, look at Cujo Lewis. He came straight from the continent. He look just like my granddaddy or my great uncle. Look at him.
Okay. Our
And
next
his
question.
daughter, his grandchildren are still there. His great grandchildren are still there. But he ain't the only one. There were 300.
Did we lose the good doctor?
Right, y'all cut out.
Hello?
I'm
Yeah,
here,
that
but
was
I don't
me.
know
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Go ahead, finish
Yeah,
your
so
point, Doc.
his people still there. So they get some kind of, do they get some kind of set asides, being that their history is so, cut and dry, when people just like, yo, we know y'all was brought here against y'all will after we even abolished. So you think they get any set asides or something like how they do the Native Americans?
Well, that will come on the new research. That's why this is important. We keep acting like this was so long ago. It wasn't. I'm telling you, my grandmother knew her great grandmother who was African born. And my grandmother, from the age of 5, started telling me everything that her great grandmother told her. And that's what sprouted my interest in Africa. We acting like this happened 1,000 years ago. Even during the Garvey movement, right? In 1921 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, there was a Garveyite who was a Civil War veteran. In 1921, this man was 115 years old, and he joined the UNIA. He stood up in front of a church. I know because it was in the Negro world. I read the whole article, and I write on it in my book. He stood up in front of the church and said exactly where his father came from in Africa at 115 years old. So 1921, a man who was born into slavery, 110, 15 years old, even 100. That means 1821. We're talking about the latter part of the 18th century.
Another similar, Amos Fortune. I got a book by him too. That's another guy who was a slave from Africa, and he came over here. He wrote and he did a little something. So,
well, it's so many. It's so many. It's not. It's hundreds and hundreds. So this is why this type of research, because these are the same people as Chancellor Williams told us 40, 50 years ago, in the 70s. that migrated. They were only recent migrants to West and Central Africa, and they were the first to go. Those small cities. So, like I said earlier, you got a man in Cote d'Ivoire who has 300 children and 100 wives. You got a man in Nigeria who has over 100 children and like 70 something wives, right? Right? That's the beginning of that's a clan. In 100 years, that's a kingdom. That's a kingdom of 10, 20,000 people. Right?
So that's
why
people
kingdom.
Wonder how
no, I want you to listen to me. I want you to hear me out. That's a kingdom. Right? In 100 years, these people in Cote d'Ivoire and in Nigeria, they will have a kingdom of 20 to 50,000 people, and their lineage could be traced back to the beginning of that kingdom to one person. But they're small, and they're up against bigger kingdoms. So during the slave trade, the European slave trade, the enslavement of our people, those small city-states were the first to go. You understand what I'm saying? Those small kingdoms were just 200-300 years old, some of them. Some of them had just recently migrated there to those areas. So they weren't strong enough to ward off other groups, and other groups being corrupted by the European by bringing in wine and cheap weaponry and cheap European goods. They were being poisoned and tricked. So those smaller states were the first to go. This is why I'm saying what I'm saying. And that is us. That's what they did first. They wiped out the smaller states. And then they later came for the bigger kingdoms. And that mentality was transmitted, was still in many parts of Africa, goes on, because Africa has yet to heal, but we have it here. But at least here, that's why I started with Michael Gomez's Exchanging Our Country March, because Michael Gomez shows how African American culture began to formulate. It was a decision. Just like the Haitian Revolution was not a spontaneous event, neither was the Montgomery boycott. It was well organized. So the formation of African American culture from many different tribal groups or kingdoms into one was organized. There was an ideological origins to it. And we can trace that back to Denmark Vesey. And within that righteousness and Ma'at was always preached. So we see these Kemetic concepts. Maulana Karanga wrote a very good journal article on Ma'at and the Civil Rights Movement. We can see Ma'at and Malcolm. We can see it in our grandmothers and grandfathers that were coming from the South. They always preached righteousness as your first defense. So what I'm saying is, many of these kingdoms and city-states that got caught up into the slave trade, some of them were recent migrants from the Sahel, and some of them had been a part of the Kemetic kingdoms and other smaller ancient kingdoms before they got into what is now known as West and Central Africa. And when they got there, they were only there 300, 400, 500 years. Some of them, and they hadn't really formulated, unless they became a part of a bigger kingdom. They had no protection. But you can see how, with one man producing 300 children, and how in 50 to 100 years that'll be a kingdom. And then that small kingdom of 20,000 people will unite with 7 other kingdoms, and now you got an empire. But what about those groups that were not able to unite because of the warfare that was going on? And the warfare continues to this day. It's a direct result of the Arab and European slave trade. The warfare is in Nigeria, and that's going on in the Congo. They continue to this day. And I'm just
Dr. Issa, we
suggesting.
gotta.
Yes, yes. I'm. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I get so passionate sometimes.
It's all good. Brother Kurt, who is a Mossi Clan member, he's in the chat room. He says, "What is the relation?" I'm sorry. He had two. His first question was, "What are two aspects of traditional African culture that have become absorbed and transformed into American culture?"
Hip hop,
Yeah.
right? Even the whole basis. Look, the basis of hip hop with the scratch. Look, Black Dot did a video on this years ago, but Black Dot was getting that information from this white anthropologist at Yale, who's a professor emeritus, right? The scratching, that's Congolese. Not only is it Congolese, we can tell you exactly what clan in the Congo it comes from and how that is an ancient communication tool. There's a lot of research now out. There's a brother out of Duke University. His name is O'Neill. He's in the Africana Studies department. He does a lot of that research on the Africa in hip hop and the development of hip hop. But Black Dot has done a lot of videos and lectures on that too. Every aspect of hip hop. And my people, on my mother's side, my father's side, we come from Mississippi. Well, both on my mother and my father's side, we're from Mississippi, but some of us ended up migrating to Arkansas right after the Civil War, and ended up, and then about 70 years later, some of us, half of the family, went to Liberia, right? Around 1900, the whole clan just got up and left from Arkansas and went to Liberia. And then on my mother's side, that one of the brothers who was in Mississippi didn't want to go, and he moved up to Arkansas and set up our clan and inherited a lot of that land, right? But many of those groups on my mother's side, we from the Congo, and we've been here in the U.S. for at least 250 years, right? But we know we from the Congo through the oral tradition and other ways that I'll talk about on another platform. But the hip hop, the ideological origins of hip hop is purely African based, and certain aspects within hip hop culture come from the Congo. The dance, the structure, and you'll see that if you're looking at you look at Sterling Stuckey's work on the ideological origins of Black nationalism. Hip hop is nationalism. It's African nation state formation. Right? Even the ham bone. Yeah, you old enough to know about the ham bone, right? You don't know about the ham bone? Ham bone, you heard? Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird. You don't know about the hamburger where you do this music? It was initiation pattern that you did with the clap of your hands and your knees.
Yeah.
And it's Congolese based. My uncle taught me this. I'll never forget when he taught me this in St. Louis. I was about 8. Right? And when the drum was banned after the Denmark-Vesey armed resistance movement, we went to using for the rites of passage, we used our hands and our knees. And we coded it. But that aspect is Congolese based. Some of them say it's Mende too. It's a mixture of Congolese, Congo, and Mende. But scratching itself, the scratching and the vibrations that come out of zika, 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 that's Congolese, and it's deep ancient knowledge. It's deep ancient philosophical knowledge. And there's been a lot of research on this, a lot of dissertations on these subjects.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see the same type of knowledge in Kemet too. You can do a comparative.
Mm-hmm.
And that's our job, as Ankh said. You know, that's our job to do that. So if y'all doing all this work on Kemet, hopefully we can recruit more people to come in and focus on Central and West Africa and those nation states that ended up being forcibly brought here to the Americas in their contributions, right? But what's happening though, they know what is happening. A lot of people are starting to look back and finding out exactly what clans they're coming from and are going back and sitting on those ancient stools in those areas. And they're changing the frequency and the vibration. Look, this stuff is so deep. In Yellowstone Park, and don't think I'm crazy for saying this. You know, the European came here and killed off all the buffalo and killed out the wolves at one point. You know that, right? And so about 15 years ago, they decided to bring back the wolf into Yellowstone Park. And by just reintroducing the wolf back, it has rechanged the ecological system in Yellowstone Park in ways that they never knew, because they wiped them out. So can you imagine when these people who were taken away go back and sit back on these stools? And there are rituals. Each family clan has rituals that are performed that govern the frequency of those areas in which they were taken from. That's why those areas are still messed up to this day, because the people who have those secrets are over in the diaspora and were taken away. But when they return, things are starting to happen. I know this. I witnessed them myself. When certain families are returning back to their ancestral homes in Africa, I've witnessed the changes. And they're happening quick. They ain't happening in hundreds of years. They're happening in decades. And this is what they fear the most. They fear this more than anything. And this, in my opinion, where the history has to move back toward. Or else, why do we study history? If it's not for empowerment.
If we don't implement it into our society as a model to get things accomplished, then it just becomes a feel-good story or an exercise that we do every year around Black History Month. So we got to implement this stuff into our everyday lives. And that's something that Amos Wilson taught us in the book, Falsification of African Consciousness, just off the top of my head. But we got one more question, and it's, what is the relation between communal labor and spirituality?
I don't know what he means by communal labor.
I'm trying to decode it for him. I guess I think he's talking about the hard work, like a community coming together to build something.
Right. So it's similar. Then if he's saying it in that way, then the analogy that I used on the gray wolf, the wolf being returned back to Yellowstone National Park 2 decades ago, and how it has totally transformed the entire ecosystem by wiping off those wolves for 40 years, destroyed the ecosystem. They thought they just wanted to return the wolf because it was the right thing to do. They didn't know that there was something spiritual in that. That they're saying now rivers that were once dried up are back, flowing. Other species that they thought were dead are now returning in abundance. So when you have groups of people coming together, particularly groups of people who for 400 years figured out, like in Ghana, right? And I reference Ghana a lot because that's my base. I've been there over 24 times, right? Studying with various kingdoms and priests, right? But they have this real big thing now in Accra, Ghana. And Accra is occupied by the Ga people, the Ga. And the Ga people moved to Accra about 700 years ago. They came from what is now known certain areas of Nigeria, right? And so being in that area for 600 years, they know when the rain is going to come, right? They know what rituals to do in case there is a drought to bring the rain. They know about the migrations of the fish. You know, among the Ashanti people on the coast of Ghana, Tuesday is the day of the water spirit. So nobody fishes because they say that day is the day that the universe used for reproduction of the fish. So nobody fishes in that area. It's a taboo to fish on a Tuesday, right? So they're learning these things after hundreds of years of being there. So you have these Christians in Ghana who are being confused by the West, who are going and they have this period in Ghana and Accra where the traditional rulers say you can't drum, you can't speak loud because the universe for that area is going through a realignment. So for 40 days you can't beat drums, right? Or it may affect the coming of the rains. And they have wars over this. But the Christians are like, well, we're Christians. We don't have to adhere to these old primitive traditions of the past. But then they started doing that. Then the rains didn't come for 2 years. And then there's drought. And then the government has to import food, which drags down their currency, right? So knowing how that atmosphere works, and I'm just bringing this back home to the question of communal work. The best communal work is done when you understand the totems of that area, the spiritual totems of that. Now we're getting into spirituality since that was the question he asked. You know, so communal work, in my opinion, our community work is not going to be complete, in my humble opinion, until we begin to understand those clans in which we come from. That is the missing link. And that is something that nobody is going to talk about. It's not being talked about. And we will finding out which clans, those Africans, those on your mother's side and your father's side, that first African who got off that ship, like Kojo. We know what clan he came from, right? And he wanted to return, but he never had the money to go back home, right? But once we start returning, one of us start making returns, we will see that something mystical is going to happen. Just like what happened with the wolf in Yellowstone. And we'll see greater communal work.
Dr. Issa, have you heard of a book called The Overthrow of Colonial Slavery by Robin Blackburn?
No.
Okay. Somebody was asking about the book, but if you haven't heard of it, you haven't heard of it.
No, just if you have a book and it's coming out of academia, right? You look for a review of that book and you see who's reviewing the book. Mm-hmm. Right. So when I want to go into a particular area that I don't have an expertise in, I generally, because I come out of academia, I can make a few calls. If I want to do Nubia, I'll call Dr. Faraghi and say, hey, what's the latest? Who are the top scholars and where are they coming from? Oh, John, you ain't gonna be able to read it because they're out of the Netherlands. You gotta know somebody who's reading in who reads that language, and they're not translating them into English. Well, then I'll say, and I don't have the time to do that for you. I'm working on my other projects. you know, but I'll go to him and ask him who are those scholars, or who are the top scholars even in U.S. history on what happened during the Civil Rights Movement, how this pacifist movement brought the world's #1 superpower to its knees. And they're still trying to correct that. That's what we see, the era of Trump. The era of Trump is here to correct the war that we waged, that we fought during the Civil Rights and Black Power movement. We got benefits out of that, right? There was a lot of spiritual stuff going on there. That stuff that they were doing, it was deep, right? And now we see a correction. They first started to correct it with Nixon. They failed. Then they tried to bring in Reagan. They didn't do much. Then they brought in Obama. Oh, man, they were able to crush us with that. And now they're bringing in the sludge hammer, Trump, right? So we got to take this history and regurgitate it and get up. And I think we need to, like Ankh is saying, I think we need to intensify our fight against these pseudos because they're hurting us. We need to intensify when you put out these videos, when you find that they are lying and plagiarizing, we need to put $100 in Google ads. I mean, not Google ads, Google, Facebook sponsor, and send that video out so that those people can see that these people are lying. They're not telling the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And that you guys have the knowledge and you guys are doing the research for this area. And here's the truth. Here's the references.
Absolutely. They always going to have their little cult followings. You know, it's very hard to stop cults. Dr. Ben and Dr. Clark couldn't stop Malachi York from becoming what he become. But at the same time, we can continue to put our information out there. And, you know, some people are going to check people's information. And those are the people that we want. The people that are truly seeking knowledge, the people that are not just going to be sheep and, you know, take everybody's word for it. I tell people, don't take my word for it. Check my references because I might have missed something. We're not perfect people, but we do try to give you the most accurate information that we most possibly can and use correct sources and get the top scholars and read their works. You have other people in the community that are not doing that. They're merely doing this to get in front of a camera to make a few dollars on AdSense or to attract some women or to, you know, stroke their egos. And that's not what we're about at the Mossi Warrior Clan. That's not what Dr. Issa is about. So we want to thank him for coming by today and sharing all that years of experience that he has and his field research. You know, you don't find a lot of people that have been to the places that they write about. You know, as easy as that sounds, a lot of people got books on places they haven't been to. So you're using secondary sources and not primary sources. So you want to try to get the best research you can get. And, you know, we were fortunate to have you today, Dr. Issa. Thank you for coming on and spending your time with us. Brother,
Right, brother.
If you got any, if you don't have a question, we can close it out.
Yeah, I'm gonna just say big up to Dr. Issa for coming through. This is a great discussion, much needed topic to go on, and I hope we get some more of this information to keep it going.
Absolutely.
Hey,
We hope to have
brother.
we hope to have Dr. Farragy if time permits. I know he's a busy man, but possibly get both of y'all on the call sometime in the future.
Yeah, man, he's working 3 or 4 jobs. But
Yeah,
I asked him, you know, maybe y'all can schedule a time for him to come on. Brother, when you got the book, The Origin of the Word, Amen, were you able to give it to the Ghanaian brother?
Oh no, that was Fortune favor. He dropped off the call, but yeah, he did. He
Okay.
say he gave it to the brother from Ghana. He did say that. So,
Oh, okay, great, great,
he'll
great.
probably give you some feedback soon.
All right, cool, no problem. Well, hey, peace, everybody, and hopefully this was an informative dialogue, and maybe you guys can use this information to add another area of research within the Mossi clan.
Absolutely, Dr. Issa. We're gonna go back and examine those sources that you gave and further our research. We appreciate you coming by.
All right, brother. Peace.
Peace. And for all our listeners out there, we're gonna continue to do what we do. I'm Black Panther here with Brother Aziz, Dr. Issa. We want to thank everybody that listened today, all the people that joined the panel. We want to thank you as well. Shout out to the Honor Rock Squad. This is the Mossi Warrior Clan. We're gonna continue doing what we're doing and pushing solutions with history and culture and study of West African and other parts of Africa through different ways and different meetings. So spirits is flying, pseudos is crying, we out.